Hi, you're listening to the Child Wellbeing Podcast, and this episode is called Early Life Undernourishment. I am Tanya, and we are going to talk to Professor Jere Behrman, William R. Cannon Jr., Professor of Economics and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Our topic today is his research on impacts over the life cycle and determinants based on Guatemalan INCAP data. Professor Behrman, welcome to the Child Wellbeing Podcast.
Thank you very much. I was very pleased to get this invitation.
Could you tell us about your experience with longitudinal studies?
I've been involved in longitudinal studies primarily in many developing countries, Ethiopia, Vietnam, India, Malawi, Ghana, Chile, Bolivia, Mexico, and Guatemala, among others. I'm going to focus on Guatemala today and tie it in with concern about nutrition, which has been a major concern of mine, and try to convey something about the research agenda as well as the data questions, but hopefully deal with the data questions appropriately as they go along. So first talk somewhat introduction about the problem, then about the particular data that we use in these studies, and then some analysis of these studies.
So what is the motivation of the study you will present us today?
So the motivation is, estimates are that something like 250 million children under 5 years of age are at risk of failing to reach their development potential, primarily in the developing world. And the primary indicator of this is stunting, which arguably has large human costs. It also has possibly large productivity costs. And there's fairly little empirical research on the latter. And what we try to do in these studies is contribute to understanding the possible productivity costs.
And what is the Guatemalan INCAP data?
So the Guatemalan INCAP data was a community randomized supplemental trial in 1969 to 1977 in two more populace, which meant about 900 or 1,000 residents, and two less populous, 500 or 600 residents in Guatemala. Two villages received atole, which was a protein enhanced supplement. The other two villages received fresco, a less nutritive drink. Supplements were available to all twice daily throughout the study at central locations in each village. The original study enrolled all children under age 7 in the starting year and any children who were born during the period of time.
Is it weight considered as an indicator of nutrition as well?
Body weight is important, but the nutritional literature suggests that in terms of long-run effects, its height is the best single indicator of early life undernutrition.
Very interesting. And how were the villages of the study selected?
So, why 4 villages, only 4 villages? I should say I was not there at the start, although I'm of an age where I almost could have been. But the reason was ultimately a budget constraint, more than a power calculation. And you'll see the program has fairly intensive resource needs, and therefore was limited to a small number of villages.
And what were the nutritional supplements given to the children?
These are the two supplements were provided. Atole is particularly more intense in terms of protein. There's no protein in fresco. Why 2 nutrients instead of a nutrient under control? The view was that there would be, through the method of delivery, and the method of delivery is here, there's a community center where every morning for 2 hours, every afternoon for 2 hours, you could come and consume all you wanted to consume, and families, or mothers and their children generally, tended to come very regularly to these centers. It was a intent to treat kind of situation in current jargon. And it was viewed by the people who designed this original intervention that there would be lots of stimulation that occurred just by coming to these centers, and therefore a pure control would miss taking out the stimulation effect. Also, the participants were not aware of any differences between Atoli and Fresco, so there wasn't that sort of information question available.
Are there ethical issues concerning the point that one supplement was less nutritive than the other one, and that participants were not aware of this?
Right. So it's not that giving Fresco was nothing. There was a very serious debate then about the value of protein. If it had been known that protein was valuable, then I think immediately there'd be an ethical issue here. But Fresco did have nutritional value. It did have energy value. It had the same micronutrients as Atoli per unit volume. It did not have the protein enhancement and had a smaller amount of energy. I think people might argue about the ethical issues of many kind of experiments. I would argue in this case that both groups were given something that was thought to be positive, and those who received Atoli were given something that some people conjecture was more positive than Fresco. So I personally don't see that as an ethical issue. And apparently the relevant people in the late 1960s did not see it.
What have been the key subsequent data rounds?
So there are a number of follow-up rounds to these data. Selected groups, 1988, 2002-4 is the one that I will refer to mostly when I talk about studies we have done. At that point, the original children were 25 to 42, and this included all children known or thought to be alive in Guatemala. 2006-7 further, and we again in 2015-7 have followed up the samples.
What was the impact of the program in severe stunting?
As a general statement, the proportions lost to follow-up are pretty similar between the Atoli and Fresco. In terms of just the original study having an impact, it did seem to have an impact on severe stunting, which in both cases was about 45% before the program started in 1969, was reduced in the Atoli case down to something like, I think it's 18%, and remained fairly a little below the starting point for Fresco. So in terms of that indicator, the program did have an impact.
Can you tell us about your analysis of early life nutrition and outcomes over the life cycle?
For most of this analysis, we basically use the following kind of framework. It's basically a difference in difference framework. We have a supplementation period, 69 to 77. We have, that implies a complete exposure period, depending on what duration you're concerned about for complete exposure. We use both 24 months and 36 months because of the nutritional literature. So complete exposure for 36 months in this case. There's a group that's too old for complete exposure for the first 36 months. There's another group too young for complete exposure, so we're going to compare the outcome for those exposed to Atoli, complete exposure versus fresco, versus those not exposed versus those not. Now there are several ways that arguably we're underestimating any effects. First, we're comparing complete with we're putting partial exposure as if it's zero exposure. Second, as we talked about before, fresco did have some positive nutritional benefits. It did provide some energy, not as much as Atoli. So we're comparing Atoli with a less satisfactory but positive nutrient supplement and focusing on complete versus more limited exposure.
And what results did you get?
Impact on education. We found this for women, a pretty substantial impact. 1.2 grades, which is 0.36 standard deviations of education. No impact for males, which we conjecture was because the more nutritious males were more useful in the fields than the more nutritious females, or you might call it gender discrimination in some sense.
Can you tell us if you found any impacts on cognitive skills?
In terms of reading effects or cognition effects, again, this is 35 years later, there's about a quarter of a standard deviation improvement if you got Atoli versus complete exposure to Atoli versus fresco. So those are pretty significant effects 35 years later.
And what about the effects in terms of economic activity?
In terms of adult economic activity, we find an impact only for males, not for females. And basically the wage rates increased by 67 cents, or about 0.45 as standard deviation, which is a very substantial increase.
And what about the impacts on health?
In terms of adult cardiometabolic disease risk, we look at a number of possible dimensions of this disease risk. I guess this brings in another dimension of these data. There's a lot of biomedical data that's been collected. Again, a plus of the original design was being able to have a nurse in the village to collect lots of biomedical data in a small number of villages and find mixed results in a sense that in some ways Atoli exposure early in life has negative effects, increased fatness, higher blood pressure, higher blood lipids, but also reduced post-challenge glucose and the odds of diabetes. So there's positive and negative effects.
And can you tell us about the intergenerational impacts?
There's intergenerational effects only for the females, not for the males. For the females, their children are about 100 grams heavier, their height, conditional age was over a centimeter greater, their head circumference was a little less than a centimeter greater. Now, that might be because of physiological effects. It depends on your model of household investment in children, household sharing, how you explain why this happens only for females and not for males. Both the males and the females had greater skills, married better, higher income, but we can't identify with certainty that it's physiological.
Can you tell us about the production functions?
In terms of production functions, I'm going to speak very rapidly about the production functions. Basically, we use these data together with the Cebu longitudinal nutrition data from the Philippines to estimate production functions. We go explore ad nauseum various questions about instrumental variable estimates. Another plus of these data are they have fairly high frequency measures of nutrition inputs and nutrition outcomes during the early life, every other month in Cebu, every 3 months in Guatemala. We basically find, and I'm going to flip through the slides without saying anything else, we basically find that there are important effects if you look at overall nutrition, overall energy consumption, worry about endogeneity and all that. There are important effects on terms of height and weight. In this case, we didn't include weight. But if you decompose that between protein sources of energy and non-protein sources of energy, all the action is from the protein sources. So this really, we think, reinforces a lot the focus on protein related to the initial hypothesis.
How did you use reference points and counterfactuals to estimate the impact of Atoli?
The first one is to decompose the impact of the subsidized protein, which the children of the Atoli village got, versus the impact of the changing reference points, which occurred in both villages, but more in the Atoli villages. And basically what the simulation suggests is that over time, about half of the increased height in the Atoli villages was due to this cheaper protein, the protein subsidy. But about half, an increasing proportion over time, was due to the fact that as new generations of children were born, their parents would look around and the 2-year-olds were taller now than they used to be. Their reference points were different. So the reference points reinforce very substantially the effect of the intervention.
Did you control for other nutrients during the program?
I'm really glad you asked the question because one advantage of this design is, I think, this wasn't necessarily the reason they did it this way, but I think it lessens the crowd out or spillover effect. In contrast, Jere mentioned earlier the Jamaican study, which is a very well-known study. It was started with malnourished children, had both a nutrition and a stimulation intervention. Only the stimulation intervention shows results after 8 years of age or something.
Do you have information on Atoli consumption?
We do have information on total consumption. And we do find, nevertheless, some crowd out, but not all that much. But I think part of that reflects this design.
What is the relevance of context in the Guatemalan INCAP Data study?
Context really matters a lot. But I've been surprised about how consistent a lot of relations are across these 4 data sets. But the second point I want to make that I think is really challenging is, suppose we had perfect knowledge of structural equations from these Guatemalan data. I think, if they're really the underlying permanent structural relations, and they really are that, but I think what we estimate may not quite get to there, and it's a pretty strong assumption, I think, that even in Guatemala, whatever the situation was 50 years ago, that's the situation that holds now. Just look at how much those curves shifted between the generations.
Professor Behrman, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. See you next time.